Okay, let's dive straight into this. Today's explainer is breaking down a really impassioned, deeply personal interview. It gives us a raw look at the socio-political dynamics of Indian Muslims right now, told from the perspective of an elderly Muslim political observer and former parliamentarian. We're going to objectively map out his historical grievances, his take on current marginalization, and a pretty radical, unconventional proposal he has for the future of democratic participation. So let's see exactly what he has to say. You know, to truly grasp the gravity of this source material, we absolutely have to start with this quote. He says, "I am over 80 years old, and every day I have to prove that I am not a traitor to my country." Wow. This single, highly emotional statement really anchors our entire explainer. It sets the foundation for all his broader arguments. He's describing a community that's living in constant fear, feeling fundamentally unaccepted despite having generations of shared history. The speaker claims this profound sense of alienation has just taken root. He describes an environment where ordinary citizens feel they're constantly viewed with suspicion. He actually likens it to waving a red cloth at a bull. And this deep sense of betrayal, that's the lens through which his entire political analysis is built. So to unpack all of this, we're following a clear roadmap today. 1, the promise of 1947. 2, the current crisis. 3, analyzing the political strategy. 4, the role of secular parties. And finally, 5, a proposed electoral boycott. Starting with Section 1, the promise of 1947 and the historical context. The speaker's narrative really begins back in 1947. He emphasizes that Indian Muslims actively rejected the idea of Pakistan, choosing instead a secular India based on a cultural fabric that goes back centuries. Then, bam, fast forward to the 1991 Places of Worship Act, which was designed to freeze the status of religious sites, and that was immediately followed by the profound trauma of the 1992 Babri Masjid demolition. The community had hoped that accepting the Supreme Court's final judgment would mean 1992 was just an isolated memory. But instead, the speaker argues that today, 1992 isn't treated as a conclusion at all, it's actually treated as a beginning for widespread surveys and new demolition notices. And the source makes a really fascinating historical argument here, presenting a hypothetical scenario about India's founding. The speaker asserts that adopting a secular constitution is literally the only thing that allowed India's incredibly diverse populations to actually coexist peacefully. He argues that imagine if India had declared itself a Hindu state right in 1947. Massive fractures would have happened almost instantly. According to the interview, minority groups like Sikhs in the north or Christians in the northeast, they wouldn't have remained part of the union. So the speaker stresses that the original secular choice wasn't just some political favor, it was the essential glue keeping the nation together. A unifying promise that he feels is currently being completely dismantled. Moving into Section 2, the current crisis and modern-day issues. The number 370 is pulled directly from the source, and it's pretty staggering. The speaker claims that recently 370 mosques received notices in places like Rajasthan alone. He describes this systematic acceleration where historically significant sites, shrines, and mosques are being targeted for demolition under various administrative excuses, like road widening or sudden disputes over land ownership. For the speaker, this is clear evidence that the reassurances of the past are entirely gone, replaced by an aggressive state-backed campaign that treats Muslim heritage as something that just needs to be erased. To really drive home this feeling of cultural erasure, the speaker draws an international comparison. He points out that in places like Spain, which obviously saw the end of centuries of Muslim rule, or Central Asia under strict Soviet control, Islamic architecture and mosques were preserved as invaluable historical heritage. Even without active Muslim populations in those specific areas, the buildings themselves were protected. The speaker sharply juxtaposes this global standard of preserving heritage with the current state of affairs in India, arguing that here their cultural history is actively being targeted and dismantled out of pure political spite. Now, the speaker makes a really interesting rhetorical pivot here, asking a very pointed question. People often say communal politics is just a tactic to win elections, right? But if the ruling party is already securing massive electoral victories everywhere, why continue to demolish mosques? What is the actual end goal here? That brings us to Section 3, analyzing the political strategy beyond just elections. The speaker makes a really bold sociological claim, comparing the political response to different marginalized groups. He argues that when violence occurs against Dalits, historically oppressed castes in India, there is widespread political outcry. Leaders from literally all parties show up. Voices are raised. It's a huge deal. But the speaker claims that when violence like mob lynching happens against Muslims, it is met with total political silence. No one speaks up. Institutional inquiries just stall out. The source argues this isn't an accident. It's a deliberate strategy by the ruling party and the RSS to engineer Muslims into becoming the new Dalits, essentially forcing them into a subservient, subjugated class that is worse off and entirely stripped of any political agency. But the strategy goes even deeper than that, according to the source, and actually affects the majority as well. The speaker argues that the RSS has successfully manufactured this inferiority complex within the Hindu majority. The argument is that an 80% demographic majority has been convinced, somehow, that their very existence and religion are fundamentally threatened by a 20% minority. By creating this constant state of fear and polarization, the ruling party successfully locks in a permanent unified vote bank. It basically distracts the majority from actual governance issues by keeping them hyper-focused on this perceived cultural threat. Let's look at Section 4, the role of secular parties and the feeling of opposition failure. The speaker shares a highly specific anecdote to explain this feeling of being failed by institutions and allies. He describes filing a Supreme Court petition against hate speech made by government officials. To show broad civil society support, they got exactly 12 people to sign it. And out of those 12, 10 were prominent non-Muslims, like retired bureaucrats. Pretty solid backing, right? Yet, according to the speaker, the court requested they actually remove the names of the ruling party officials from the petition, which basically rendered the entire effort completely toothless. This anecdote is proof to the speaker that democratic institutions are compromised. On top of that, he views the so-called secular opposition parties as equally complicit. He argues these parties are so terrified of losing the Hindu vote that they remain completely silent on Muslim persecution. In his eyes, Muslims have just become catalysts in Indian politics, the group that gets targeted so others can win elections. And he brilliantly illustrates his view on tokenism with another specific story. He talks about a Congress MLA in Hyderabad who won his election but was then totally marginalized by being assigned only to the Minority Affairs Ministry. Realizing he was going to have zero real power or broader policy influence, unlike the past where Muslim leaders actually held chief ministerial roles, he just resigned. The speaker uses this to impartially demonstrate that even when secular parties win, they still refuse to grant genuine political power to Muslims. They just offer token appeasement to keep them quiet. Which leads us to our final section, Section 5, a proposed electoral boycott as a radical solution. The speaker defines the current era as one of minus Muslim politics. It's a political landscape where the ruling party has proven, without a doubt, that it can secure absolute, sweeping electoral victories without needing a single vote or any support whatsoever from the Muslim community. Because their vote has been rendered statistically irrelevant to the ruling party, and because secular parties just take that vote for granted without offering any real protection, the speaker concludes that participating in traditional voting is now completely obsolete. It's just meaningless for their community at this point. So what is the strategy to break this cycle? Well, the speaker outlines a pretty surprising three-step vision. First, he calls for the formation of a collective leadership made up of intellectuals, scholars, and civil society, moving entirely away from individual politicians. Second, this collective leadership must announce a complete unified boycott of the electoral process by all Indian Muslims. Nobody votes, period. Third, by entirely removing the Muslim community from the electoral equation, the speaker believes they can actually short-circuit the ruling party's polarization strategy. Think about it. If Muslims aren't even participating, the whole Hindu versus Muslim narrative falls apart. That would force the majority to finally vote based on actual economic realities. And to highlight exactly what those economic realities are, the speaker points to a startling figure, 12,000 rupees. He notes that highly educated youths right now, graduates, postgraduates, across the entire country, are working on temporary contracts for just 12,000 rupees a month. The speaker argues that as long as the religious distraction is there, the government is never going to be questioned about this. But if the Muslim community withdraws, the public will finally hold the government accountable for the poor wages, the massive youth unemployment, and the struggling economy. The political fight will return to livelihoods, not religion. Which brings us to the end of our explainer and leaves us with a profoundly heavy question to consider. If an entire minority group feels so marginalized, so unprotected by institutions, and so completely abandoned by their political allies that their only remaining strategic move is to entirely withdraw from the democratic process just to force the country to focus on its own economy, what does that reveal about the health and the future of that democracy itself? It is a stark, provocative thought from our source interview, and one that really challenges how we view the mechanics of democratic participation. Thanks for joining me to break down this complex perspective today. Keep learning and keep asking the big questions.